Well, thank you for having us. We're very glad that we can be here sharing a little bit of our work. It might be somewhat different than what some people here do, which is nice, so we can exchange ideas. And as Ben said, my name is Dali, and I'm part of a team at Google that is called Jigsaw. I think the website is jigsaw.google.com, so you can probably go to the website and learn much more than what I will tell you now. But basically, we build technology to keep people in the world safe. And none of our products are for profit, and we explored what are the most vulnerable people and how we can help them online. As you can see on there, our UX team is really, really tiny. We're only 4 people. So for research specifically, we partner with Key Lime, and I'm here with 2 of my colleagues, Eugene and Ember, and we'll be presenting together since for the past 3 years, we've been doing this research together. Yeah, so we wanted to start with a little exercise. Nothing to write, it's just thinking exercise. But we have a prompt just to get you thinking of the kind of people that we do a lot of research with. So imagine you're a researcher, easy, and you have been tasked with understanding journalists' sentiments, workflows, way of thinking when they want to publish information without saying who they are, without revealing who they are. So a few questions to think about, then maybe we'll ask people to give us their answers. So we'll give like around a couple of minutes. Mm-hmm. These are the 4 questions we'll like you to think about. So in terms of recruiting, how would you recruit this type of individuals? How and where would you conduct this type of research? How would you get them to feel comfortable speaking to you? And what about if they don't want to sign or they have concerns about signing something like an NDA or a confidentiality agreement? So a couple moments if you want to think about the answers. Feel free to talk also. I'm sorry? Oh, of course, yes. Yes.
Do you mean anywhere in the world or anywhere?
Anywhere in the world, yeah, actually a good point, yes.
Yeah. So one thing this makes me think about is with journalists, that journalists would be using very similar methods that do investigative. Journalists would be using very similar methods that do investigative reporting, especially if they're going into war-torn countries, if they're covering political issues that are difficult, going into communities or neighborhoods where they may not be from those areas and they're dealing with sensitive topics. So I would think of using some of those same methods that a journalist would use.
Great point. Great. Yeah, maybe anyone has any ideas about recruitment? How would you find journalists or people who want to publish things anonymously?
So I don't know if, well, it feels like for this type of recruiting, it's really helpful to gain trust of like 1 or 2 key people in the field and then have them help you recruit people because it's a very specialized group of people. And so you can gain the trust of, you know, one person and it can magnify.
Yeah, like a network. Good. We'll be speaking about that. Any other thoughts?
In the back over there?
Someone here.
Hello, everyone. Usually, if I'm doing research on a different country or if I want to get information on people from different communities, it's always important to try to research who do I already have in my circle that's from that community. So I find it saves a lot of time. Then from that people, they can introduce you formally to the people that will give you that information that you want.
Great. Awesome. Maybe we don't need to present. I'm just, you guys have so much fun. We'll be summarizing some of those ideas. Any ideas on how and where you will conduct this research? And again, it can be any part of the world, but would you do it in a lab, go to people's homes? Yep.
I think this is where like country-specific data is really important, because you would want to know what is the like journalism culture in that country, right? Like, do we really have to be worried about wiretapping? Do we have to be very worried about like email communication given the government's policies and all of that stuff? So I would want to do one step before that and figure out what is the context that they are currently living in.
Great point. Any thoughts on getting people comfortable with you to speak about such a sensitive topic?
Assuming it was like culturally appropriate, I think I would want to do it in a space like a coffee shop where there are other people, as opposed to like, you know, asking to invade their home or asking them to come to my hotel. I'd want them to feel like they could come and go and weren't, you know, being penned in. And I would also probably ask them, where's a local place that they like? So not only is it like a open space, but a space they're familiar with more than I am.
That's a really great idea, asking them rather than you proposing something. Lastly, any thoughts on NDAs, why we would or not want to try to do this, and what happens if the person doesn't feel comfortable doing it? If you want to talk about the previous one, that's fine too.
I had a thought, it might kind of touch on the NDA piece as well, but like I was thinking a little bit about like what Zora Neale Hurston did in her ethnography work, and like meeting with the person multiple times and really like going the extra lengths to like build rapport and have it be a two-way street and have things that you bring to them that benefit them as well, so that it feels like once they're kind of making some of these sacrifices, like for example signing the NDA, like they'll be more willing to do that because it'll feel reciprocal.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts? Great. I guess the way that we got to the point where we are now that we can share best practices was by making a lot of mistakes. So a lot of the things we learned the hard way by doing. We have different backgrounds. My background is in human factors, working in the aerospace and autonomous driving world. So yeah, all the stuff I had to learn little by little. So here we are to share with you who we consider people at risk. And just really quick, I wanted to mention that at risk or saying something, like people facing security challenges or vulnerable are all working terms. We talk about this a lot. I'm sure other people also publish information, and there's right and wrong ways of saying different things. We'd love to talk to other people if you have ideas on how we should call the people using our products, but this is just sort of like an easy term, and we'll use it throughout this presentation for the purpose of that. There are people facing security challenges who are susceptible for harm or danger, and it could be online or in the physical world as well. So Mohammed Russell, he is a journalist for Vice. He was downloading some legal software when he was doing research in Turkey, and he was detained for around 4 months. And he is an example of someone that for us will consider at risk because he's doing the work that he does. If you've been in Syria since 2011, you're at risk because of where you live, nothing else. Security and again physical are both risks that you're facing every day. You might be at risk because what you want to share online, something like coming out, sexuality or gender or any of the topics that you might be willing to share in a different platform, you might be at high risk because then you might be attacked or harassed online. And finally, decisions made by companies that sometimes they don't mean to might put people at risk as well, such as revealing information or changing different regulations that expose people in different ways. And the more and more we've been thinking about who are people at risk, we also realize that anyone at any point might be at risk depending of different situations. And you and I could also be targeted just because we participate in this world, basically. So keep that in mind as we're speaking. Obviously, we're taking a little more of the extreme examples, but really this can be applied for anyone that is online.
Thanks. So in the work that Key Lime has been doing, specifically with Jigsaw and Dali's team, and the type of technologies that they're building, designing and these technologies and thinking about people at risk is at the forefront of our minds in terms of how we just go about doing our normal day-to-day. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 reasons why it is even more critically important to think about the nuance of designing for people at risk. So the first one I'll talk about is amplified effect. And what we mean by that is, as UX practitioners, we're constantly thinking and defining who our users are. So there's a product that we worked with called Outline that is sort of like a VPN. It allows people to access information that might be censored or blocked, depending on where their location is, anonymously. And the team internally started to think about and try to identify who are the users of this. And they thought that the users were going to be journalists, right? Journalists can use this to access information, to share information anonymously. And what we started to uncover as we got deeper into it was that the journalist was part of a larger ecosystem of users, but not really the user of the product that was being designed. The user was really more the IT person who was going to, make the decision, install it into the system so that people like journalists and consumers can access the information that they're pulling. And so, there was a sort of a distinction being made in this example between who the actual user was versus who the beneficiary was. And that manifests itself almost in every product that we do user research for on Dali's team. It's not just a single user. It's an ecosystem of individuals, both technical and non-technical, that we are consistently having to consider and think about. In addition to that, and we sort of learned this by going through the process and understanding sort of what that workflow was like. It wasn't, and it isn't always very apparent at the beginning exactly who the product is supposed to be designed for from an interaction standpoint. So another reason why it becomes important for us is sort of stress testing. Right? So when you're doing UX research, generally speaking, we're looking at and identifying the most common use cases. When designing interfaces or technology for people at risk, the edge cases in some instances are of even greater importance. So frequency is not the only indicator for deciding, what we test for, where our focus is. A lot of times it's about identifying maybe the most critical moments where you might put someone unintentionally at harm. And so in those instances, we have to consistently look at those edge cases where it really sort of is the moment of truth of whether or not the technology can deliver on its promise ultimately, ultimately to its user base. And that's a little sort of counterintuitive, right, in terms of the way we generally are going about prioritizing where we focus our testing or our design efforts. Being here at REcon and thinking about sort of the future of UX, we, for us, the definition of what is included within usability is something that is consistently evolving, and the nature of the work that Dali's team is doing really forces us to start to include metrics around safety, digital safety, physical safety, become just as important as the other sort of UX metrics that many of us encounter or design for on a daily basis.
Yeah, something I wanted to add here is that I feel like we're doing such a better job at including accessibility and designing for all people everywhere in the world, as well as different abilities. But just this is sort of like another area to add to that. So if the future includes accessibility, it should also include at-risk communities.
And when we're talking about security threats or safety, Dali had mentioned this before, it can come in the form of digital safety. It can come in the form of physical safety in many cases, and we'll talk through some of those. Another thing that we like to keep in mind as we're going through is the impact. Someone raised a question, I think it was you. You raised a question about location. Where are we thinking about? And in many instances, the team is designing products for folks globally, and people in at-risk countries, really have the odds stacked against them. So, in terms of censorship, in terms of access or lack of access to tools and information, and so that's at the forefront of the team's thought process in terms of identifying who it is and what is available to them, and really sort of weaving that into the design and the UX process is important. Okay, and so to help sort of build that vision of a future, we've created some guidelines through trial and error that we'd like to share. Dali was joking because in the Q&A at the beginning, many of you in the room sort of identified many of these things. So, but we'll go over them nonetheless. Before I get into the guidelines, just want to make mention that the guidelines here occur throughout the various phases of the research process. So sort of keep that in mind as we're going through. Okay, so UX guideline number 1 here is focusing on the moments. And for some, it might be kind of counterintuitive, right? When we're thinking about users, one of the speakers earlier talked about creating personas and thinking about user goals and that sort of thing. And, we approach research in that same way, but we identified over the course of, multiple projects that there are commonalities at these various sort of moments that are easily identifiable, that sort of span and include, various people. So it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, sort of when you are. These moments seem to do a better job of helping us identify what's of critical importance, at that particular time. And so there's a sort of a list of common attributes that we cover. So these are 4 moments that we've identified. Even though it looks linear, it isn't always linear. It doesn't always happen in these steps. People don't find themselves at risk at all of these steps. Sometimes it's one. It could be all of them. You can find yourself at risk, at one moment multiple times. And so either way, we'll still sort of talk about it, but just wanted to sort of make that distinction. So in terms of prevention, some examples there, or the mindset that the user is in there, is that they're getting set up to protect themselves, so that they, being preemptive. And that can include information gathering. So when you're thinking about design and someone who's in the prevention moment, really surfacing the type of information that they need at that moment to achieve their goal becomes a focus in terms of design. That can include, in some cases, digital security training, right? Making those types of things available to the users is something that typically needs to be considered. When we're talking about the monitoring moment, there it's more about constantly being aware of status. How protected are you? Are there any vulnerabilities? Again, are there things that they should be looking out for as key indicators that they, may be coming under attack? And so in those instances, making things easily accessible to sort of status and settings and permissions and things like that becomes more important and more of a focus at that at that
I'll give an
particular
example
stage.
of monitoring. So something we heard a lot from people at risk is the location-based services. So basically, you're revealing your location at all times. So someone in the prevention phase might be figuring out, do I want to turn it on and off, and maybe getting information in the moment, what does that mean? But the monitoring might be that icon that is constantly reminding you that you're sharing your location.
The next one I'm going to talk about is crisis. So examples there really is, when you're under attack. So it could be a privacy breach. You could be actively getting hacked. Your password could have gotten stolen, those sorts of things. And so that's, this is an example of if the technology is working as intended, isn't something that happens with a great deal of frequency, but it is, the critical moment that you need to sort of understand, what is happening. And it leads into sort of the next stage in terms of recovery. What does that include? How do you get people sort of back online, protected once again? And I'll talk about this in just a moment, but, putting oneself at risk from a digital security standpoint in certain situations has, real world physical ramifications. And so recovery here can also include things like counseling. So the major takeaway here is that moment-specific thinking is important when designing for people at risk. Okay. The second guideline that I'm going to talk about before I pass it over to Amber is context. So a young lady back there mentioned in terms of an approach to prepare yourself to identify what's important or how are you going to go about doing this. The team goes through painstaking detail and process at the front end, really sort of getting all of the context that is needed before any sort of development work or even idea generation happens. And so that's a lot of looking at secondary research, tapping into your network that you have in terms of identifying and figuring out what's happening, how do I, what's the current situation, what are all the things that I need to be mindful of, who do I need to talk to, how do I need to talk to them, becomes critically important.
Maybe I'll provide an example because of that photo. We actually went to Ukraine to do research on what was the state of digital security. And we first had to learn about the history of Ukraine and why were they in this, how did they get to be in this moment? And that was the only way that we could then have conversations with people when we traveled there. So we probably spent around 2 months doing this research, speaking to experts, getting an understanding of all the events that happened before we traveled there. So it's really important.
And then I touched on this briefly, but again, activating a network. So again, leveraging those relationships that you have. In some instances, the team is working on products where there is no internal expertise. And so identifying who those key partners are that we can talk to, that we can leverage, that can help make an introduction to an expert in the field that we can ultimately tap and sort of, start to uncover things deeper becomes important and valuable. We're consistently partnering with, organizations who have been doing the hard work well before the team sort of focuses on and thinks about a particular area of focus. And that's the second one here. You want?
Yeah, I think I will touch on the next slide. Oh, no.
Oh,
Sure.
well,
Sorry.
I forgot the last one here. And the other thing here too is, about creating a security plan. So this here, again, is around creating the right context. And this is really about sort of preparedness, really thinking through the things that we have here on the slide in terms of, what might be at risk for the individual. Amber will talk some through, and I missed the talk earlier this morning, but there was a gentleman who was giving the first talk about sort of the ethics and sort of how you prepare. This is very much about being very proactive in terms of identifying and creating a plan so that you can sort of mitigate things before they occur.
Yeah, we have a lot of information on how to create a security plan. We're happy. We didn't want to include that whole thing here, but basically sometimes you might be putting the person at risk only because you want to interview them. So if you think about that ahead of time, that helps you think of also what will be alternatives. If the risk is really high, you might choose not to interview that person, for example. So just thinking very thoughtfully about what are the risks both for the person as well as yourself. And there might be other risks such as the security of the data that you're collecting, even the equipment, depending on the location where you go. So considering all those things and actually writing out a plan is really helpful to make sure you can mitigate it. And I'll speak about this part quickly, and some of you also touched on this, but recruiting is not very straightforward. Like many of our projects, we have to speak to journalists who have been doing investigations against the government. Obviously, it's really hard to find them. So we've, Jigsaw created 2 different programs, and I'll speak about them. Again, not expecting that this is something that everyone can do on their teams, but maybe you can start thinking about how you can create communities rather than thinking of recruiting, which is the same thing, just thinking about it differently. So one program we have is called User in Residence. And what we're doing proactively is bringing people that have the expertise, so digital security experts, journalists. We're bringing now someone that is a disinformation activist in India, and they spend about a month in our team. They have a badge, they come to our office, they have a desk, and during that month we plan activities, so they give talks, and then they also have brainstorming sessions with our engineer teams, and they have talks with the PM. So basically we're learning about each other, and we're slowly creating a community. So when it comes the time that we need to test something, we already know this person, and hopefully that also opens up opportunity to speak to their colleagues and friends and other people doing the same work. And the second sort of tip, which is meeting people where they are, I guess both in depending on what's the best location for meeting them for research, but also we do a lot of traveling to where they are, actually. And we're trying to combine these 2 programs. So for example, we had someone from Zimbabwe spend a month with us, and then that same person led a trip to Zimbabwe where we were able to bring the PMs and engineers and interview people on the ground. So if this is possible for your team and it's something that you will be excited, I'm happy to talk more about the programs and how we made them happen. But it's all about thinking of creating a community and really meeting people rather than bringing them to you. So.
Cool.
Thank you. So before I get started, how many of you actually get an opportunity to speak to users and consumers one-on-one? Wonderful, so you already know all of this. Okay, great. So I'm just gonna highlight some things that I think are very important, because our goal as a researcher is to get the information, and normally as quickly as possible, because we've got engineers and designers like, hey, where's my stuff? Where's my info? So when conducting interviews, my job as an ethnographer is to like immerse myself in the culture, right? So recently I just conducted, we conducted ethnographic interviews with African Americans to better understand their perceptions and expectations of safety. So speaking to Dali and Eugene's points of all the things you need to do prior, this is what happens when the interview is about to begin. And one of those things is creating a safe space. That means something different to everybody. So ultimately, I just asked my participants, hey, where do you feel most safe? Everybody was like, I feel safe at home. I was like, cool, I'll meet you at home. As long as you're comfortable with that, that's where we're headed. Another thing is being able to prioritize setup time. I don't know how many of you like bring videographers along or photographers, but I do. I like to capture that so it can bring a more robust story to my insights. So I have a videographer, and depending on the location, my videographers may change. Some videographers take 10 minutes, some take 30 minutes. So I always keep in mind that I need a little setup time, and that may be important, especially depending on your location. You may need to be a little more incognito about who you're bringing in and what you're bringing in. For some of the individuals that we spoke with, we had to go through certain neighborhoods that weren't always that safe. You have neighbors and residents that hang out. The last thing they need to feel is like you're a narc walking through, meaning a cop walking through their neighborhood with equipment and stuff. They're like a red flag for whoever's house you're going into. So something to keep in mind. We wore like our backpacks and stuff and try to stay incognito, but even still, just something to be cautious about. Another big one is be on time. I know that seems so simple, but sometimes people take for granted other people's time, right? So I always like to arrive, like I'm sitting outside their house for like 10 minutes just to be sure that I'm there. I call ahead of time. Hey, it's Amber. Just letting you know I'll be at your house. Meanwhile, I'm like really outside their driveway. But just letting them know that I'm constantly building that trust, building that rapport. I'm being considerate of their time. Because depending on who you talk to, some people have either taken off work, some people have their caregivers, they only have a certain amount of time that they can allot to talking to you about their experience. So just being considerate. And then also, again, ensuring comfort. I don't know how many ways to like explain that to everybody, but it's a way of talking to them in a way that's just approachable. I know it's easier to say go with the flow, but sometimes people don't always know what that means. So just say hi, how are you? Things of that nature. Very approachable and personable tone can take you a long way in these interviews.
Maybe I'll add to that. We were reading about this, bringing together a comfort kit. So sometimes the stories that we're eliciting or the topics we're approaching are difficult. There might be tearing from both ends. Yeah. So like having things that will make the person feel more comfortable. Right. Also, so in both ways.
Tissues and water and things like that. Normally though, I always have like a participant asking me if I want water or if I want tissues. Yeah. But I'm not the one crying in the interviews. But sometimes, yes, you want to have that as well. And a lot of times they end up offering you the same thing that you're offering them. So luckily, you can tell at that point, oh, we're all on the same page. We all want the same thing. And then again, remembering that security plan. What is your exit strategy should things take a turn? Should your safety be a concern and their safety? You know, of course, as a researcher, we put ourselves in situations that sometimes put our safety at risk, and still we're worried about the participant's safety. But it's also just very smart to keep in mind that we're worried about ours and theirs. So always have that safety plan in mind or security plan in mind, and be willing and able to talk through it with your participants. So like, if I hear gunshots, I'm gone. It's not up for discussion. You know, like, but being very open about that and being very outspoken to say, I'm trying to look out for you and for myself. And as a researcher, sometimes we have to prioritize that. Interviewing with empathy. How many of you all think you're empathetic? I know, right? I'm the same way. So when sitting there talking with people, like some of them have the most sad yet vivid stories of their experiences. And it's up to you to listen with intent, but also like keep your expressiveness like to a minimum. And I don't know about you all, but I have no poker face. So if I'm feeling that story and it's hitting close to home and I'm like, inside I'm tearing up, I am trying not to express that much emotion in front of the participant. That's fine if you like, wait a minute, I think something's in my eye. You can have those moments for sure, but try to stay a little less expressive so you can get the most out of your time and hear really what's happening. And then also for our gentleman Jim who spoke earlier, I've not had to talk to white supremacists before, so I'm not really sure how that conversation would go. But when you're considering hearing stories that don't necessarily align with your moral compass, you also have to keep those expressions, you know, intact. I don't want to be sitting there looking like, my ugly face is coming. Like, I want to be very mindful of that, right? So keeping in mind to try to stay neutral. It's okay to like, okay, you know, nod your head and confirm that you're hearing them and hearing their stories. All they want to do is be validated. They don't need to feel like they're being shamed for their experiences or how they cope with their experiences. That's the last thing we need to do. And then also, this is one of my favorite, allowing silence to take its course. There's nothing wrong with awkward silence in an interview. Sometimes you got to give a person a chance to gather their thoughts, gather their emotions. Maybe they're not sure how they want to take this story. With the interviews that we recently did, a lot of African Americans had stories of death, had stories of mental health, mental illness in their families. Those stories can take, some people like, I need a second. They're like, hold on, can you push pause on the camera? I mean, the whole nine. They're not asking you to fill in that gap of space. They're asking you for space. So being self-aware to realize when that awkward silence is needed and necessary is very important. And then parting ways, debrief together. You know, be able to talk about like, okay, you've already signed the NDA, so now I can tell you this information is going to be used internally. We're all going to debrief. We're all going to talk about it, see how we can use this data to make the world a safer place. We can go through that. And then also being willing to take that time, that extra 10 minutes to talk to them before you leave is very important, because you never know when you might need to meet them again. Here recently, we conducted research 3 weeks ago, and we had an opportunity to go back to one of the cities that we researched and reach out to one of the participants and say, hey, you mind talking to us again? Now, had I just gotten all my information and bounced, that wouldn't have been building trust or rapport for us to reach back out to him. He's the expert, so we had luckily had a great experience together that he was like, oh, I'm happy to meet you. And to your point earlier, I called him, I said, hey, where would you like to meet? I mean, of course, I want five-star fine dining, but I understand that not everybody wants that. So we were basically at like a, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with like a Golden Corral, or like a buffet style type of, he was like, that's my spot. I was like, we'll see you there at 5:30. Everybody was happy. Everybody was able to eat. So we were very excited that we had built up enough rapport, enough trust that we were able to reach back out 3 weeks later.
And something I'll add to that, some people, especially in this area, they really want to know if they can read the report when you put it together or how they might participate going forward. They want to test the technology that you're creating because you're going to be helping their community. So really laying out like, okay, we might get in touch with you again.
Yeah.
We might not get in touch with you again. And that's something that sometimes happens too.
Yeah.
Just being upfront, I guess, ends the interview in a much better note. Yeah.
For sure. And being honest about that. Like, yeah, we might not actually reach out to you again, but we thank you for your time. We appreciate your time. I think normally that is set up in the beginning, and luckily for the project that we recently did, our recruiters were very hands-on with all of our participants, so they all knew what to expect. They all knew what was coming, and at the same time to be asked to come back was more of something that they were excited about, because they all knew that this is only 90 minutes of my time and then I'm done. Discussing next steps is what we just talked about, and then taking care of yourself. I don't know how many of you all have like sat in and like binge watched documentaries all day long, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I'm so depressed from hearing all of this. Like the world is crumbling underneath my feet. I have those moments sometimes as a researcher where it's just too much information. It's so heavy that you realize that some people are going through real life like this and still manage to, at the end, be optimistic, keep a smile on their faces, and they've had some of the worst experiences, and sometimes they don't see an out. They may not ever experience an out where we actually get to leave when we're finished with them. And so I always think it's very important to be aware of like secondary trauma that can occur with you. And whatever that time is that you need for yourself to just regroup, we would like have debriefing sessions, and I'm like, I just need a minute, guys. Like, this was heavy for me this week. All that meant was like, I need to take a bubble bath or something. But it was something that I needed, that I knew I needed in order to regroup and get ready for the next week of research. Some ethics that we talked about, or that we need to talk about, because also with some of Jim's information that he shared earlier with the individuals that he spoke with, how do we keep that information safe, right? So we're talking to the other half of the group outside of Jim. Jim's talking to the white supremacists. We're talking to the people who are being marginalized by the white supremacists, okay? Just to put it in context. So if you don't have counsel within your organization that handles this type of information, it's up to you as the researcher to be very mindful in how you store this information, how you share this information. Certain things, certain tactics that you may need to consider are getting like certifications. Also being able to defend against breaches, being clear about who you're talking to. Like, for instance, I'll pick on you in front of me. Say we're having a conversation about this, about some of the research, some of the data that I collected, but you overhear me, right? That's a data breach. That's that simple. And we as researchers have to be very mindful in minimizing the use of names when, from our participants, because ultimately these people are people, right? So we don't want to put them in harm's way, in additional harm's way than they might already be in. Oh, and sorry, go back to the certifications. There are opportunities for you to get IRP, institutional review, and then just staying up to date with what some of these certifications are. Also some discipline commitments that you may have as a researcher. If you have those opportunities at work to find out what those certifications are, get involved and add those to your name so that people know that you're a reliable researcher, even if you're consulting or out on your own in the field. They know that even if you don't have that support from council or from individuals in your organization, you can be trusted, right? Because we want to build the trust with our participants, but also back with our organizations that they know we can handle this type of information.
I think we take for granted, many people come to research, a lot of us with an academic background, but other people without it. When you are in school, you have this IRB process, and there's a group of people who actually review all your projects, and they make sure that it's ethical and that there's no data security breaches. But then we go on our own, and people that might not have that as part of their training, and we don't have that group. You have to be it, and we might forget. So that's why the certifications or reaching out to organizations that do this type of work might be helpful.
And at Google, some of the tactical ways in which we limit opportunities for data breach are limiting the number of people that we share information with. So, for instance, some of the data that I shared was shared to these two people right here. Until I got permission to share with some of my other colleagues, then that's when I did. But I didn't take it upon myself to just start, copy and paste to everybody on the team and be like, look what I did. I was very mindful of the fact that I had to start with my team leads and then go from there.
It's something very tactical, but we wanted to show it because it's a little bit of an obscure feature. If you have G Suite or use any kind of Google products, you can actually limit the amount of time that you share your data with someone.
For sure.
So that's that little watch thing that appears when you highlight their names. And you can say only for 30 days or something. So that's one way, so that way you don't have to remember.
For sure.
And this is another kind of trick, but you can also limit how much that person that you're sharing with has an ability to reshare. So you can limit downloading and sharing by also a little bit of an obscure feature. And I'm happy to show people if you have questions afterwards, but you can do that from the settings in any doc or sheets.
So ultimately, we want you all to be open and mindful to protecting the participants that you speak with, protecting yourself, and then protecting the data in which you collect. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, we have time for questions or comments.
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah. Besides the outlet to talk to their situation, which I'm sure a lot of at-risk people are looking for, what sort of compensation do you provide your participants? I guess would it be respective to situation like access to certain resources or even financial help?
And because we are part of Google, we have set standards that Google has in terms of what is a good compensation for. So we try to follow all kinds of, if someone already put out a rule, we try to follow that and be complacent. So it's a monetary reward depending on the time that you spend with the person and the type of research. So if it's a diary study versus in person. But I will say that we also do research with government officials, and then it becomes a really tricky and long conversation on how do we make people feel like their time is being valued when we can't really compensate them with any kind of monetary reimbursement. We worked with an organization recently where we were able to donate funds to their favorite charity. So we try to be, or we give like Google swag and things of that nature. So we try to be creative, but always trying to think of compensation as part of it.
Oh.
I just wanted to ask how you choose your projects, and if there's anything you wouldn't do. If there's anything you've refused to do or wouldn't do, and how you choose.
So the question is, how do we choose our projects?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of journalism, but is there other stuff that you?
Yeah, we were talking about this, that we're presenting a lot of how we do research, but not on what. Maybe that would have been helpful to add the slides. But basically, we have 4 different areas that our team works on. Censorship is one of them, online conversations, and making sure that they're positive and with less harassment is another one. Keeping people safe, it's another one. So the projects really come depending on what the product teams are working on.
Oh, somebody right here? We're running.
Hi, you talked at great length about protecting your interviewees because of their situations, their status, their political views, etc. What about protecting yourselves? Because if these people can be potentially in harm's way because of their situation, their positions, etc., is that ever a factor?
Yeah, absolutely.
They may be comfortable in a particular location, but you never know.
For sure. One example I'll give you from the participants that I spoke with recently, we had someone who, I try to Google map before I go to certain locations, but not every time. I'm just kind of like, oh, surprise. This particular house made me very nervous. I will be honest. And not just because of where it was located, it was also in a like high crime, a lot of police officers riding around. But also when I got inside, it was very dark. I couldn't really see. But my goal for that is I never go to a house by myself. That's why my videographer is normally, no offense ladies, but is normally a man. Just in case, you never know. Sometimes you might need that reinforcement of just kind of power and stance. I take full advantage of that. But together, we're normally talking to one person who's home alone. And again, I've had opportunities to speak to these people several times before even arriving there. So it's not just to screen them to make sure that they can speak to some of the questions that I have, but it's also to make sure, like, is this person kind of crazy? Like, that's how I do my own screening for my own security. Because it's always something that I worry about, being an ethnographer and always being out in the field.
Especially when you're thinking of that security plan. Hopefully that was clear. One of the questions is the security of the person, but the other one should be about you and your organization and the data you're collecting. Hopefully you're doing a risk analysis before you get to that point.
For sure.
But as a team lead, what I always advise researchers, if you feel like that at all, you leave. Because you can always say, I'm sorry, we can do this another time, or thank you, and you still compensate them, but you didn't put yourself at risk. So
All
that
I
would be
did was
my advice
I moved
always.
from being inside the house to sitting on the porch, where we were out in the open, videographer. Yeah, we took a different approach because I didn't find the participant to be someone that I should fear in any way, but her living arrangements were a little skeptical for me. And so I went outside.
Is it ever an option, if you get a uncomfortable feeling in advance, is it ever an option just to conduct the interviews over the phone?
Sure,
Absolutely,
yeah.
yeah.
If you feel the need that you need, if that's the route you feel comfortable taking, there, as the researcher, and of course your team leads, you discuss that amongst yourselves, but safety first. I mean, we all, know that. If I ever got to the point where I was like, oh, no, we're gonna call, we're gonna do this over video chat, then I would definitely take that route. But I haven't felt that my safety was. That I haven't felt unsafe yet. I've definitely felt like, you have some people who make inappropriate comments as a woman, as a researcher. You have those situations, but my safety per se, no.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello? Yep. So my question deals with discoverability and then kind of performance of the services that you guys are providing, given the audience you're working for. Can you speak to how you think about how your services are discovered by your intended audiences, and then how you would track whether they're used by the audience you're looking to help and in a way that's helpful for them, especially since it's so hard or a challenge to find these folks? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe the same example Eugene brought up, Outline, is a good example. It's a product that it's a VPN that allows you to create your own network. So basically you're routing the traffic, but not through someone else created infrastructure, but the one that you create. So it's completely confidential. And when we were designing for journalists at first, we knew that if they had to do a lot of things to create a droplet and then a lot of technical things to create the server, that was a huge major hurdle. So thinking about what the technical capabilities of your user in general, they're not very technically advanced. So that's something we have to keep in mind. I guess when we realized through a lot of work that our user was an IT person, we were a little bit relieved. I think now our product is much better. So it's come like 2 or 3 different rounds of redesign. So now it's much easier to use. But I will say that it's easier for an IT person with the training to use it than a journalist. And now we're doing another round of research to understand why journalists are not using the tool a lot. So we partner with the marketing team and the partnership team to tackle together, trying to figure out what are the large organizations that that they should be using our product but are not. As researchers, we're going to try to answer why. And then the marketing team and the partnership team are going to help us also figure out what are the regions and the organizations that we should be talking to. So it's a current challenge. Our tools, are not easy to find. They're not easy to use. And that's something we always have to keep in mind. Yeah, and we're only 4 people as a research, as a UX organization. So we're constantly fighting with engineers and PMs that want to take a different route than what we're trying to tell them to do. So it's a lot of collaboration. And I wouldn't say that we're there yet, but we have a better idea, at least, than when we started.
So I'm currently doing user research where our users are undocumented immigrants and their families. And so that's a very complex legal, cultural, political context. Have you come across any particular tools, or do you use any particular strategies to communicate the complexity of that context to the rest of the product team?
It's interesting, depending, I don't know exactly what your whole team, but because when you come to work at Jigsaw, you have a good understanding of what you're tackling with the technology. So we're only 70 people, and all the engineers, PMs, marketing, our team, we all kind of have a good sense that everything we do is sensitive, that we're dealing with at-risk communities. So we don't have to do a lot of convincing or explaining. I would say like everyone is super careful. What we need to do a lot is like that part of taking care of yourself, because sometimes it takes a toll on the team dealing with all these issues so much. So I haven't had to work on that at all, unfortunately or fortunately. So yeah, I guess explaining to the rest of the company what we do sometimes is challenging, or not explaining, and people want to know more and we really can't share because of the sensitivities. But luckily everyone is on board as to what we're doing and why. I don't know if you have experienced that in other capacities.
Are you also asking like some of the like report outs and things like that, like the things that you're sharing based on the data you received?
Right, so this is even before we do like interview data or survey data, just so that the rest of the team has an understanding of this very complex context that they will be designing in. So communicating that, because right now I'm doing, because I come from like an academic background in that space, so I'm the one who's been
coming in,
made responsible for kind of drafting up. I don't want to do a report because I know people are not going to read it. So trying to come up with documents or deliverables that will be able to communicate the complexity that they're designing in before we even start the actual primary research.
So maybe I'll share an example. I think I shared a little bit about Ukraine. So when we do what we call user experience research trips, expeditions, I drill on how important it is to the context. And I send lots of links for people to read and watch this Netflix documentary and all this stuff. And I realized that it's hard for people to find the time to do it because it's almost like an extracurricular activity besides what they're doing. So for the last trip that we did to Zimbabwe, I actually had the team work on making posters of the information they were learning about Zimbabwe, and then did an expo for the whole team where they were presenting what they learned. So before we went on the trip, everyone had to do their own secondary research, interviews, whatever they wanted to do for their posters, and then they presented out in kind of a cocktail hour type of event. And that was helpful. I feel like they learned more than trying to ask them to read materials and documents. So maybe including them to some type of activity might be helpful. That was helpful for us. because the context of going to a country that it was the first time people were voting in a democratic election. We were going to be speaking to journalists, and we can't just go to the country without understanding the risk and the context. So we had the team actually do the research.
Yep. And the user in residence program is another activity to really try to get people immersed and sort of excited about the work that they're doing. And I think it goes without saying in the room, you know, when you're able to bring a stakeholder to watch research or to hear directly from the person or the type of people that you're designing for, it tends to have a profound impact. And so perhaps considering something like that, where you can allow the person to help communicate sort of the complexity of it, so it's not you sort of on behalf of this large group of people, could potentially go a long way in terms of sort of getting more people sort of on board, understanding, and again, sort of like excited about what it is that they're doing.
I can add something that might help you. I'm in healthcare, and healthcare is really, really complicated for anyone who's like gone to the doctor in the United States. You know what I'm talking about, or signed up for insurance. So one of the things I did when I joined the organization I'm in now is they're creating products for patients, but they don't really understand the ecosystem the patient is in, how complex it is, especially for patients who maybe have multiple conditions, are poor, have all these circumstances. So while they don't have fragile immigration status, as you're describing, it's very similar for people who are very sick in this country, right? They are often marginalized, they're not heard. So one of the things I did when I came on board, and I said to my manager, I said, you know, what would be helpful, I think, for the whole team is to level set them on the complexity of this ecosystem. And I'm not like you. I'm not going to write a report about it. No one's going to read that. So what I did is I created like 3 or 4 PowerPoint slides, because that's what I'm familiar with, not because that's an amazing tool. It's not. That was very visual, and that showed all the connections between the different stakeholders for the patient. Mm-hmm. And I made it really complicated and hard to comprehend to get across that this is what you have to deal with, right? Your thing that you're making has got to live in that ecosystem. And we did that, like you're saying, before we even began research, to level set everybody on. Remember that this is what you have to do. So that could be one approach that you take, given that you're dealing with kind of a fragile population with security concerns and things like this.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we're out of time. Maybe one more question.
So considering how things like digital and online security are becoming more important just more generally, like for the general population, do you ever see instances where the things that you're working on might apply to a larger population?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that was the whole point of trying to convince people that considering people at risk in your designs, it's important because of this amplification effect. And the example we gave with Outline, I think the last component is that you're helping then people access information. Everyone that can access the piece that this journalist wrote is benefiting from it. So we started noticing that as a pattern in all our products. And that's kind of why we feel so strongly that even if you can consider at least one small piece of someone that might be going through a digital security or a security breach, you're amplifying that effect to making your product better for a lot more people, which is exciting. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and please find us if you have any questions.